The sunlight poured through the thin lace curtains of the room, casting soft golden streaks over the faded floral quilt covering Eleanor White. At 89 years old, her once vibrant spirit had been dulled by the relentless erosion of time. Eleanor's body, frail and uncooperative, had become a cage. Her once sharp mind flickered like a candle on the brink of extinguishing. Her family had tried everything, pleading, coaxing, and even stern words. But Eleanor had refused to eat for days. She was done, she had told them in a tone of quiet finality. Done fighting, done living. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The room was filled with the muted hum of medical devices and the occasional rustle of a nurse checking vitals. Eleanor's daughter, Susan, sat by her mother's bedside, her face lined with worry and exhaustion. Susan had been watching her mother slip further away with each passing hour, her heart heavy with the helplessness of not being able to do more. "Mom, please," Susan whispered, holding a spoonful of broth near Eleanor's lips. But Eleanor only turned her head slightly, her lips pressed together in refusal. Eleanor's eyes were open but distant, fixed on some unseen horizon only she could perceive. She thought of her life, of the years she had spent working tirelessly as a schoolteacher, of the laughter of children echoing in the classroom, of her husband Walter, whose steady presence had been the anchor of her world until his death 15 years ago. Those memories were warm, but they also felt like echoes, distant and unattainable. What was left for her now? She had outlived her husband, most of her friends, and even one of her children. Her body was no longer hers to command, and she could feel the pull of a great silence, inviting her to rest. The house was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that seems to anticipate something. Susan had stepped out for a moment to take a phone call, leaving Eleanor alone with the steady rhythm of the clock ticking on the wall. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her exhaustion sink into the mattress. But then, breaking the stillness, she heard something. A voice. Not just any voice, but one so familiar and deeply etched in her soul that her breath caught in her chest. "Ellie, my love," the voice said, soft and warm. Eleanor's eyes flew open. For a moment she thought she was dreaming, but the voice came again, rich with the tenderness she had longed for all these years. "Ellie, it's me." Her heart raced as her gaze darted around the room. At first she saw nothing but the familiar objects of her confinement. The IV stand, the worn armchair, the framed photograph of Walter on the bedside table. But then, as if summoned by her need, the air seemed to shimmer, and there he was. Walter, her Walter. He looked just as she remembered him, strong, steady, with that kind smile that had melted her heart so many times. He stood at the foot of her bed, his eyes glowing with love. "Walter!" Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking with disbelief. Her hand trembled as she reached out, though he was too far to touch. "Yes, Ellie," he said, stepping closer. His presence was so vivid, so real, that Eleanor felt the years melt away. The wrinkles on her face seemed to loosen, her body feeling lighter for the first time in ages. "I'm here!" Tears slipped from the corners of her eyes as 1,000 unspoken words crowded her mind. "But how? Am I—" Walter shook his head gently, his expression both tender and firm. "No, Ellie, not yet. It's not your time. But I couldn't wait any longer to see you." Eleanor's breath came in shallow bursts, her emotions tumbling over one another. Relief, longing, joy, and confusion. "I've missed you so much," she whispered. "I've missed you too," Walter replied, his voice steady and sure. He pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, and Eleanor marveled at the sensation, wondering if her mind was playing tricks on her, or if some miracle was unfolding before her. "You've been so strong," Walter said. "So brave. But Ellie, you still have more to do here." Eleanor frowned, her frail fingers clutching his hand. "I'm tired, Walter. I don't have anything left to give." Walter leaned in, his eyes locking onto hers. "Do you remember the promises we made? How we said we'd take care of each other no matter what? Ellie, this is my way of keeping that promise. You have people who still need you. Susan needs you. The grandchildren need you. They need your stories, your love. Don't leave them yet." His words were like a balm to her weary soul, yet they also stirred a flicker of resistance. "But I'm so old," she said. "I can't even feed myself anymore. What good am I to anyone?" Walter smiled, a smile that carried decades of shared history and love. Ellie, your worth isn't in what you can do, it's in who you are. You've always been the heart of this family. Don't let them lose you just yet. Eleanor felt a tear slip down her cheek as her resolve began to waver. The weight of his words combined with the warmth of his presence was more powerful than anything she had felt in years. A part of her wanted to argue, to cling to the peace of letting go, but another part, a part she thought had long been extinguished, stirred with a faint ember of life. As if sensing her hesitation, Walter leaned closer, his voice low and urgent. Ellie, there's something I need you to know. The love we've shared, it doesn't end. It never ends. But you have to carry it forward. Show them how strong love can be, even when it feels like there's nothing left. For the first time in days, Eleanor felt something stir in her stomach. Not just hunger, but a yearning. She thought of Susan, of her grandchildren, of the world outside this dim room. They deserved more from her, even if all she could give was her presence. She looked at Walter, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can. Walter's smile widened. You can, and you will. I'll be with you always. The moment stretched, charged with an unspoken energy. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, Walter began to fade, his form dissolving like mist in the sunlight. Eleanor's heart clenched. Wait, she called out, reaching for him. But his voice lingered, steady and sure. I'm always with you, Ellie, always. The room returned to its quiet state, but Eleanor felt different. The air seemed lighter, the colors brighter, as if the world had shifted just slightly on its axis. When Susan returned, she was startled to see her mother sitting up slightly, her eyes more alert than they had been in weeks. Mom? Susan said cautiously, stepping closer. Are you okay? Eleanor's gaze met her daughter's, and for the first time in days, she smiled. A small, fragile smile, but a smile nonetheless. I'm hungry, she said softly. Susan blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. You're hungry? Eleanor nodded, her voice gaining strength. Yes, bring me something to eat, dear. Tears filled Susan's eyes as she rushed to the kitchen, returning moments later with a small bowl of broth. She held the spoon to her mother's lips, and this time Eleanor didn't turn away. She sipped slowly, savoring the warmth that spread through her chest. Each swallow felt like a step back into the world, a small act of defiance against the pull of the void. Over the following days, Eleanor's strength began to return. Not enough to get out of bed, but enough to engage with her family, to listen to their stories, and to share a few of her own. The grandchildren visited, their laughter filling the house as they crowded around her bed, hanging on to her words as she recounted tales from her youth. The transformation was subtle, but profound. Eleanor's body remained frail, but her spirit seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. She told no one about Walter's visit. It felt too precious, too sacred to share. But every now and then, when the room was quiet and she was alone, she would close her eyes and feel his presence. A comforting warmth that reminded her she was never truly alone. As the weeks turned into months, Eleanor found a new rhythm to her days. She still tired easily and her body remained weak, but her mind was sharp, her heart full. She began to dictate letters to Susan, messages of love and wisdom for her grandchildren to read when they were older. She shared recipes, stories, and advice, ensuring that pieces of her would remain long after she was gone. Eleanor knew she wouldn't live forever, but that no longer frightened her. When the time came, she would face it with the same quiet strength that had defined her life. For now, she chose to stay, to love, and to live as fully as her fragile body allowed. And when her time did come, she knew Walter would be there, waiting to take her hand and lead her into the next great adventure. For now, though, she stayed. And in staying, she discovered that even at the end of life, there was still room for miracles. Eleanor's renewed spirit reverberated through her home, touching everyone who crossed its threshold. The family had stopped counting the days, and instead focused on each moment, cherishing the unexpected gift of Eleanor's presence. The change in her was palpable, not just in her willingness to eat or engage, but in the radiance that seemed to emanate from within, as if she were carrying some secret hope no one else could see. Eleanor spent her mornings by the window now, propped up with pillows, gazing at the garden she had lovingly tended for decades. Winter had stripped it bare, but Eleanor imagined the spring blooms she wouldn't live to see. It wasn't sadness she felt, it was gratitude. Even in its starkness, the garden was a testament to cycles of life. She asked Susan to read to her from the journals she had kept over the years, rediscovering forgotten details of her life. One morning, Susan began reading from an entry dated June 1962. "Walter surprised me today. He planted lilies along the fence because he knows they're my favorite. I laughed at how crooked they were, but oh, how I loved him for it." Eleanor chuckled, the sound light and musical. "He was never much of a gardener," she said, her voice threaded with affection. "But those lilies bloomed for years. Every time I saw them, I thought of his clumsy hands trying so hard to make something beautiful." Susan paused, looking at her mother. "Mom, you have so many stories. Maybe we should write them down together. For the kids." Eleanor tilted her head, considering the idea. "Perhaps we should," she said. "But not just for the children. For you too." And so began a new project, one that consumed their afternoons. Susan brought out an old typewriter and began transcribing as Eleanor recounted memories, weaving them into a tapestry of love, loss, resilience, and joy. Some stories were humorous, like the time Eleanor accidentally set the Christmas pudding on fire, and others were poignant, like her memories of Walter's quiet strength during hard times. Each tale carried a lesson, a piece of wisdom, or a glimmer of hope. One story in particular struck Susan deeply. It was about Eleanor's decision to become a teacher. "I wasn't supposed to go to college," Eleanor said. "Back then, women were expected to marry young and start families. My father told me it was a waste of money, but I couldn't let go of the dream. I loved books, and I loved children. I wanted to give them what my teachers gave me, a belief that they could be more." "How did you convince Grandpa?" Susan asked, her fingers poised over the typewriter keys. Eleanor smiled. "I didn't. I just went. I saved every penny from my part-time job and enrolled without telling him. When he found out, he was furious. But by then, it was too late to stop me. And when I graduated, he was the proudest man in the room." Susan looked at her mother with new eyes, marveling at the determination that had carried her through so much. "You've always been stronger than you let on," she said. Eleanor reached for Susan's hand, her touch as light as a whisper. "Strength doesn't always roar, my dear. Sometimes it's as simple as doing the thing you know you must, even when it terrifies you." As the weeks passed, Eleanor's stories began to form a patchwork quilt of her life. Susan noticed how her mother seemed to grow lighter with each memory she shared, as if unburdening herself of the past was giving her new energy. But there was one story Eleanor hadn't shared, one Susan had never heard but instinctively knew existed. "Mom," Susan ventured one evening, "can I ask you something?" Eleanor looked up from her tea, her eyes still sharp despite the fatigue in her body. "Of course, dear." "What was it like after Dad passed? I mean, really like. You never talked much about those first years." The room grew quiet, the air heavy with the weight of the question. Eleanor took a deep breath, her gaze drifting toward Walter's photograph on the bedside table. "It was like learning to walk again after losing a leg," she said finally. "Every step hurt. Every breath felt wrong. For the longest time, I couldn't see a way forward. But then, I remembered something he used to say. Life doesn't stop for our grief, Ellie. It carries on whether we like it or not. I realized he was right. I didn't have the luxury of stopping. I had you and your brother to think of, and I had myself. I owed it to him to keep living." Susan felt a lump form in her throat. "I don't know if I could have done what you did." Eleanor smiled faintly. "You'd be surprised what you're capable of when you have no choice." That night, as Susan packed away the typewriter, she couldn't help but think about the quiet strength her mother had carried all these years. She saw it in the way Eleanor had kept the family together after Walter's death, in the way she had faced the indignities of aging with grace, and in the way she had chosen to keep living even now, against all odds. One day, Eleanor surprised everyone by asking to be taken outside. It was unseasonably warm for late winter, and the sun was shining brightly. The family bundled her in blankets and wheeled her out to the garden. Her eyes lit up as she took in the crisp air, the bare branches reaching skyward, and the faint hum of life stirring beneath the soil. "I used to sit out here every morning," she said. "Walter would bring me coffee, and we'd talk about the day ahead. Sometimes we didn't talk at all. We just sat together, listening to the birds." Her youngest grandchild, Lily, climbed onto her lap, wrapping her small arms around Eleanor's neck. "Do you think Grandpa can see us?" she asked innocently. Eleanor kissed the top of Lily's head, her heart swelling with love. "I think he can," she said, "and I think he's smiling." The garden visits became a ritual, a way for the family to connect with Eleanor in her final days. They planted early bulbs together, their hands working the soil as Eleanor watched from her chair. She directed them with a sharpness that belied her frailty, insisting that the tulips be arranged in neat rows and the daffodils scattered freely. "You'll see," she said. "Come spring, this place will be alive again, just like it used to be." Her words carried a double meaning that wasn't lost on Susan. Eleanor wouldn't be there to see the flowers bloom, but she was leaving something behind. A living reminder of her presence, her love, and her legacy. As Eleanor's body grew weaker, her spirit seemed to grow stronger. She began speaking to her family about things she had rarely mentioned before, her fears, her regrets, and her hopes for them after she was gone. To her eldest grandson, Michael, who had been struggling to find his path, she said, "Don't be afraid to fail. The only real failure is never trying." To her granddaughter, Anna, who had just started her career, she said, "Work hard, but don't forget to love. At the end of the day, love is what matters most." And to Susan, her rock, her confidant, she said, "You've been my anchor, my strength, but don't lose yourself in taking care of others. Promise me you'll take care of you too." Susan nodded through her tears, clutching her mother's hand. "I promise." Eleanor's final days were not marked by sadness, but by a profound sense of peace. Her room became a hub of activity as family members came and went, sharing laughter, tears, and stories. There was an unspoken understanding among them that this was not just an ending, but a celebration of a life well lived. On a quiet morning, with the first hints of spring in the air, Eleanor took her last breath. She passed peacefully, surrounded by love, her hand in Susan's. The room was filled with a profound stillness, as if the world itself was pausing to honor her departure. In the days that followed, the family grieved, but they also found solace in the memories Eleanor had left behind. They read her letters, flipped through photo albums, and tended to the garden she had so carefully planned. When the tulips and daffodils finally bloomed, they stood as a testament to Eleanor's enduring spirit, a burst of life and color that reminded them of the woman who had taught them the meaning of love, resilience, and hope. And though Eleanor was gone, her presence remained. Susan often felt it in the quiet moments, in the rustle of leaves, or in the scent of lilies drifting through the air. She would close her eyes and hear her mother's voice, steady and sure, reminding her to carry on, to love deeply, and to live fully. Eleanor White's story did not end with her death. It continued to unfold in the lives of those she had touched, a legacy that would bloom like the garden she had left behind, beautiful, vibrant, and eternal. The tulips and daffodils, planted just weeks before Eleanor's death, blossomed with a vibrancy that seemed almost supernatural. Their colors were brighter than Susan remembered, and their delicate fragrance filled the air. The flowers stood as living reminders of Eleanor's final weeks, her determination to create beauty even as she neared the end of her life. Susan felt a strange comfort in tending to the garden, as if the act itself was a continuation of the bond she shared with her mother. One afternoon, as Susan was pruning the roses that had started to bloom along the garden path, she noticed Lily, Eleanor's youngest grandchild, sitting quietly among the flowers. In her small hands, Lily held a notebook, a gift Eleanor had given her during one of their final visits. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" Susan asked, kneeling beside her. Lily looked up, her bright eyes filled with purpose. "Writing stories like Grandma used to tell me," she said. "She said I should make my own someday, and I want to." Susan's throat tightened as she watched her daughter's small hand carefully scrawl words across the page. It was as though a piece of Eleanor's storytelling spirit had been passed directly to Lily, a legacy of imagination and love that would continue to flourish in the next generation. "Can I see?" Susan asked gently. Lily hesitated, then handed over the notebook. The story was simple, about a magical garden where flowers could talk, and the trees whispered secrets to those who listened. But the heart of it, the wonder and curiosity that filled every line, was unmistakably Eleanor's influence. "She'd love this," Susan said, her voice soft with emotion. "You're just like her." As the weeks went on, the garden began to draw others in the family as well. Michael, who had recently decided to switch careers and follow his passion for architecture, would sketch designs while sitting under the old oak tree. Anna, after long workdays, would stroll through the paths, finding a sense of peace she hadn't known she needed. Even the youngest grandchildren would run through the yard, their laughter echoing off the garden walls. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us. What are your thoughts on why the woman refuses to eat at this point? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.